The next thing you might be interested about is how can we transfer the data from Ignition to the Python code and vice versa. As we previously talked in our Flask environment, we have an option to choose a route which has parameters in it. So this way we can send some values or some any kind of parameters that we want from Ignition to our Python code. However, when we are dealing with machine learning, we are usually working with lots of data. And this method is maybe not the best option we can choose to transfer all our data from Ignition to Python. Instead, we can, for example, use a database. So here I have a database created. Its name is ICC 2021, and it is a Postgres database. In it, I have several tables. I have the heat demand, where I have the values of the required heat for every hour in the 1 month period that we already talked about. In the same time, I have, for example, the weather data, which takes the same time points or the same hours, and the weather, the outside temperature that was measured at that hour. We also have another table called heat demand predictions, where we can after store our predicted heat demands again for every hour. So if we have this database, you probably already know how we can connect to it from Ignition. So for example, we go to our Ignition gateway, to the configuration section, and we configure our database connection to connect to this ICC 2021 database. We can check the settings of this connection. So here we can see that we are using the Postgres SQL database, and here we can enter our username, password, and so on, and if we need any more configuration settings for our database connection. So once we have configured that, we can go to our Ignition designer and, for example, create a named query, which will take the values from our database from one or more tables. So for example, I have this named query called get heat demand, where I take the values from a stored procedure called heat demand info. This stored procedure will just join the two tables of the heat demands and the weather forecast and bring all the data in one table. For example, we can test out this named query and see that we get for every time point, for every hour, we get the temperature and the heat demand that was required at that moment. So now that we have the database and we have it connected to Ignition, we can of course store or take the data from the database in our Ignition solution. But we also want to make a connection to the same database from our Python code. To show you that, I have created this file called db.py, where I have created just a simple code to access the database and to take the same values as we did in the named query in Ignition. So as we are using the Postgres database server, we can use a library in Python called psycopg2, which allows us to easily connect to our database and to perform any kind of SQL queries on the database. So the first thing we need to do is to connect to our database, and this library has a method called connect, to connect to the database. And in order to connect, we need to provide a connection string, which should consist of the host name, our server host name, then the port number that we are using to connect to our database, the name of the database, because of course we can have different databases on the same server. And we need to provide the username and password for authentication for our database server. In order to store these connection parameters, I have created a separate file called connectionparameters.py, where I stored all these values for the host name, the port number, database, username, and password. And if you want to make your solution more secure, you should probably consider different options for encrypting your password and your username and all the different options provided in this connection parameters, so that your solution is not vulnerable to some attacks. So as I previously said, the way to connect to the database is just to use the connect method from the PG2 library. And with that, we get a connection to our database. If everything is connected, we can just delete our connection string. We don't need it anymore. And after that, we can, for example, use the read SQL query from the Pandas framework, where we can say which database connection we want to use. This is our connection that we just established. And we can just write the SQL query that we want executed with our database. In the end, we have to make sure that we close our connection to the database, and with that, we finish this little code. So, for example, I will put a breakpoint here and just run it in a debug mode. So at this point, we are connected to our database, and we have this con, which is a connection object to our database, ICC 2021, with my username and password. And in the next line, we can just run it and get our database data as a Pandas data frame, where we can see that we received the same temperature and heat demand data that we saw in Ignition. In a similar way, we can also use different kind of SQL queries in our code. So, for example, we can instead of fetching the data, we can update the tables or insert new values to the tables, which we will definitely use once we finish with our machine learning predictions or other kinds we do to manage or to work on our data. And if we want to save any changes, we can do it directly from the code. And then the data is in the database, and we can again access it from Ignition and load them into tables or graphs or like trend data and so on.